Welcome to Fill the Void podcast, where we discuss unhealthy human habits caused by the society of consumption. Hi everyone and welcome to Fill the Void. Today our guest is John, a war veteran turned spiritual guide. He navigated from the trauma of 12 years in conflict zones to helping others discover their inner light and purpose through the intersection of spirituality and practical living. Hi John.
Hi, Roberta. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you for being here. It's a pleasure. First of all, I want you to tell us a bit more in detail about your story. How did you start in this path?
Sure. Yeah, right out of high school, I didn't go to college. I joined the military straight out of high school. I enlisted in the U.S. Army and became a counterintelligence special agent. And that was about a year before 9/11. So I went to basic training, did my job training, and I got to my permanent duty station about 6 months before 9/11. And then 9/11 happened. And then, it was just, we were at war. And I spent half my enlistment, 2.5 years in Kuwait, so supporting troops in Afghanistan. And then when the U.S. invaded Iraq from Kuwait, I was there for that. And then when I got out of the military, I essentially joined as a civilian doing the same job that I had been. And so I spent that 2.5 years in Kuwait, spent about 18 months in Baghdad, and I spent 6.5 years consecutively in Kandahar, Afghanistan, and a few places in between. But that's the big parts of it. And so 12 out of my first 15 years of my adult life, my youth, I was at war. And so that was kind of a formative experience for me. Lots of low-grade trauma that I had to deal with. Then there's the trauma of every day, just kind of that you don't know what's going to happen. And then there's the high-grade events that happen, the big events, the missile attacks or rocket attacks or truck bombs, stuff like that. So, dealt with all that, and it was difficult, but you don't really notice it at the time, right? Because you're doing your job.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
I
exactly.
didn't really,
You were feeling at the time that you were like numb in a certain way.
yeah, very much. Yeah, and I was working probably 110 hours a week, 7 days a week. So I didn't really have time to think about anything, right? Just do my work. And I believed in what I was doing. I was way more idealistic back then and believed I could change the world and help the world, even though I was part of this like dark military industrial complex machine. And so I think the longer I was in that machine, the more I realized the darkness of it, kind of the evilness of it at times, like the fact that we're all just
Yeah.
human. And so being at war, you know, once you get past the first few days of war and whatever anybody says the war is about, eventually it just becomes this thing that consumes everything around it. And it's I'm not into politics, but from a philosophical sense, it's like a political tool. And so we're just kind of wandering around fighting the enemy, quote unquote enemy, and they're just trying to live their lives and we're just trying to live our lives, and we're fighting each other and to very little end, I think. So
Yeah, it's like as if we were all puppets directed by a huge entity, and in reality, yeah, we are all like controlled in a certain way.
yeah, absolutely. And I think society, I like that because like I would later find out. I mean, I've done some work since then, obviously, and yeah, I think society tells us all these things that we have to be or we should be or we don't want to do or we shouldn't do, and we have to work our way through that, all that conditioning that we've been through.
Yeah, yeah.
So
How did you dealt at the moment, and how did you come to the realization that you were numb and you wanted a change? How did that happen?
I kind of completely burned out. Like I had worked so hard for so long that I just kind of flamed out and didn't have anything left. So I left Afghanistan, came home to North Texas with my wife, who actually spent most of that time with me. We had the same job for the most part. And so we came home, and that was in 2015. And I didn't have an identity. I didn't really
Mhm.
know who I was. So the next 7 years was just time where I was lost, trying to figure things out, trying to heal. Time helps. And I think that was where that's kind of like this middle phase between like figuring out who I was and leaving that really damaged part of myself, you know?
Yeah, I really love like where we're getting at in this conversation because in my concept of filling the void, I also like went to through a similar experience of like being something. I was like a professional athlete, and then I had to pivot and change and become like a normal human being in society. So that change, like coming back to society and not knowing how to function, that really affects us even more than I say when we have to pivot and become something else, it affects us more than a death or like an extreme situation that can happen around us.
Yeah, I think that the parallels between like what I lived as a soldier and then a civilian doing the same thing and what you lived as a professional athlete or what a creative person or artist does if they're completely dedicated to their craft. And then that changes. Uh yeah, I love that idea of that void that you're left with. And you have to then like be very introspective and say, who am I?
Exactly. And how did
Yeah.
you realize how did you start this path of building the person that you were, or how did you dealt with that pain of not knowing and being lost?
I started to at some point I've kind of had this realization that things were not flowing. And so one day I just kind of said, I don't care anymore. Not in like I don't want to live that kind of way, but just like I'm just gonna take life as it comes every single day. And I wasn't really on a spiritual path when that happened, but I think that really helped set the tone for me to be able to wake up eventually. And so that was the start of it. And and then about 2 or 3 years later, that was probably that would have been about 5 years ago, and then about 2 years ago, I had this profound moment of clarity, understanding, people call it awakening, where I had this sense of the oneness of the universe and loving kindness, and I knew who I was, and I knew what my higher purpose or my dharma in the world was, and that it was to help people help themselves find their wholeness, find their light that they already have inside, even if they can't see it, they can't feel it. And I knew that all the spiritual philosophies or all these religious philosophies, even if you're an atheist, I feel like we're all saying very similar things, even if you're a scientist. I feel like we're saying very similar things. We're pointing to very similar directions, even if we see it from a different perspective. And so I thought, what if I could go and try to help people have those conversations together, figure out what their own unique, empowered path within themselves is, because we're all on a unique path. So that was kind of the turning point for me.
And how do you help these people find their spirituality? And what does spirituality mean to you?
That's a big question. Spirituality to me means, I think, a connection with something bigger. I think if for me, it's a connection with, I call it the universe. It could be the divine. It could be that self with a capital S that's behind consciousness. It could be the Tao or the Brahman or Christ consciousness or any of these names that people give it. It could be base consciousness if you're a scientist, because scientists can't get behind consciousness. They know it exists, they believe it exists, but they can't explain it. So I think everybody could call it these different things, but it's the same. So to me, that thing, whatever we call it, that spirituality, our ability to touch it, to see it, to try to have some level of understanding about it is what I define as spirituality. And I think that my effort in working with people, whether it's in a community setting, which I think is a very rich experience, I think we need that authentic, meaningful experience even in the digital age online, or if it's one-on-one individual guidance or coaching, the goal is for people to get in touch with that part of their spiritual self. And I'm also very much interested in how we align that in our quote unquote concrete world every day, because we do walk through this reality that we inhabit with all these other people.
Yeah, and how difficult it is to connect with this like higher self or higher energy in the society that we live in, because the society in which we live right now doesn't help us. It even disconnects us from all of the things that would make make us available for that,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, it takes away our awareness. It takes away our intention. It takes away all these things that are these like super valuable tools to us that if we use them, the world's brighter. We have more joy in our life. We have more peace in our life. But we choose to like embrace the distraction. We choose to embrace the negative messaging. Uh, it's thrust upon us. I absolutely think whether it's the algorithm, whether it's Madison Avenue and advertising, whether it's our parents or teachers or our coworkers or our job, it's thrust on us, but we still have a choice about how we receive it.
Yeah, yeah. It's all these filling the voids that are
Yeah,
numbing and tempting us to disconnect from what we should be connected in reality. And when you were at war, that in the you were like in the mix, you were just going and going hard, so it was hard for you to stop and think. So in that moment, all these situations that you were living, could you describe and tell me some of these things that you've lived in those moments that were hard for
sure.
you?
Yeah, I think that's a good. That's a really good. For me, it was being able to not be overwhelmed in the moment. There's all this fear. I had there's fear of being killed. There's fear of failing. I had this really core desire to succeed because I felt like it was a life and death thing sometimes, or it was success of the mission, and other people depended on it. And I had a desire to win. Whether that was right or wrong at the time, I can look at that differently now. But I wanted to win. And I wanted to protect people that I thought were important to protect, that I was conditioned and trained to protect. And so I was dealing with that fear. It was not being overwhelmed by the moment because in war, what I found strange in war, and it's interesting you brought this question up because people hate making decisions in war. They don't want to make decisions. They don't want to decide where we're going to send someone or where we're going to put this plane. I think I never had a
Interesting.
problem with that. You know, I think one of the reasons I was very successful at war is because I had no problem. I had a lot of confidence to say yes or no, we'll do this or we'll do that. Let's make it happen. And then just be comfortable with whatever happened. I had this like massive core of confidence that served me quite well. I think that's one reason I was able to do what I did for so long and do it well. Um, and I think war gets very complicated when you're fighting it. Like it's hard to get people to say yes to things. It's hard to get. It's just there's all this red tape. It's this it it's a it's a lot worse than people think it is, even from a from just like a bureaucratic perspective.
Yeah, and I feel nobody really knows what it is about. We just know what we see in the news and like all these things that come out, but like you had lived this from inside.
Yeah, it's a machine, and the thing is, it grind. We're grinding the enemy up. The enemy's trying to grind us up, but we're also the U.S. and Western military industrial complex grinds its own people up, right? Like I saw so many people get ground up by the system. Uh, and I think that's part of it that's unseen is that the system itself grinds people up. And in addition to the trauma, in addition to all the other stuff, it's tiring. It's this tiring process of dealing with this giant machine. So yeah, it's a very exhausting thing. And I don't know where I found this infinite energy to work 7 days a week, 110 hours a week. I don't know where I found that energy. I think there was something I was in touch with something spiritual back then and didn't know it. I was, you know, and I think when you live something and you're dedicated, we talked about it earlier a little bit, when people are dedicated to craft like you were as an athlete, or you know, when you're fully invested in something, I think you're touching the universe there. Like you're touching this universal something.
Yes, like in a different way.
Yeah, not in a great way sometimes. But
Yeah, but I
it's
get what
that
you're saying.
yeah, that balance of the universe. There's dark and light. And I think my experience of all this darkness gave me great perspective now to see I can choose to see the light more. you know.
Yeah. Everything is about the choices we make every day. Exactly.
Yeah.
And so, what could you say that your past life in war gave you as a tool that you utilize today positively?
I think one thing it did is I was such a driven person, and I was at war, but I was, I can relate to people who are driven professionals uh that need spirituality in their lives. They need to be in touch with themselves. They need to be in touch with something that's beyond them. Uh I think that's helpful in talking to people because I think it helps speak a language that they speak. Uh and I think those people that are these driven professionals are sometimes the hardest to get through to because they're so focused on winning or
Yes.
being the best. And I can appreciate that drive. I was part, like I said, I had it. So I can speak that language a little bit. So I think that was useful in being able to relate spirituality to people who maybe need it the most.
Yeah. And I like what you're saying, this of like winning or losing, because I also had this mentality like where you want to win, and basically you are a winner or you're a loser, but life is about grace also. So
Ah, yes.
how did you deal with this when you finished this extreme life of like black and white to be able to integrate?
Well, no, I think grace is it. I think self-love. It's once you learn, like, the least selfish thing that we could ever do in the universe and the world is to take care of ourselves first. It's the oxygen mask in the airplane, right? You put your own mask on first. So, and
Yeah.
our society teaches the opposite of that. Our society teaches us to take care of everyone else first, and then maybe never take care of ourselves. And so
Yes.
it is grace. It is self love. It is self care. It's all those things. It's forgiving yourself, having non judgment for yourself, and have that same thing for other people. Obviously, yes, but start by having it for yourself, and then suddenly you're free.
And I'm going to ask you a silly question, but everyone and many people, even you see on Instagram, forgiveness and says thank you. And you can read it and so many times. And yes, like forgiveness, but like how can you forgive yourself fully? How is that? How do you do it?
Yeah, that's a great question because forgiveness, we preach it, we talk about it, we all talk about it. In the spiritual community, it's huge. Self-help community is huge. But it's not a switch. You don't come out and declare I forgive and it's done. You have to actually check back in with yourself and say, well, am I still attached to that? Does it still, uh and there's all this stuff that we can figure ourselves for. And like I've had, in addition, there were some times where I wasn't overseas in between where I had some businesses that failed. I had a house that my wife and I tried to build, and the contractor screwed us over, and we ended up having to pay the bank back like half the house because it never got built. Like huge financial difficulties that I felt was like my fault and not my wife's, and I felt responsible for it. So it's this stuff that I did as a soldier, these dark things, this evil that I was a part of. But there's also these life things, right, that are just everyday things
Yeah.
that everyone experiences. So how do you forgive that? But I think you have to slow down. You have to say, I forgive myself. Like there's literally nothing that you can do to change it. You
Yeah.
can't go back in time. The
Exactly.
person that you think is holding it against you probably isn't. And if they are, that's their attachment. It's their problem. And so I think there's all these things on a checklist. And I think it's incredibly complicated. I don't think forgiving yourself, people talk
Yeah.
about it like it's just this overnight thing, right? But no,
Yeah.
this is a process.
And even when other people, sometimes it's forgiving yourself because of something with yourself. Maybe sometimes there's not even others involved. And that's, I think, is the hardest.
Yes. Yeah.
But
Yeah. We're exactly. And I think and that goes down to choices that we made. And I think that we have to look at the universe as that balance we were talking about. And we're not walking in the black. We are definitely not walking in the light. We're walking in the gray in the middle. Now we can choose to
yes,
look at the light as we walk that gray path, or we can choose to look at I think that's where the choice is. But we have to recognize that we're walking a great path. We have to recognize, I think we can accept, I think acceptance, right, is huge in forgiveness. Acceptance. I accept who I am. I accept that I'm this imperfect thing. I think we're imperfect. That universal thing, that self behind our human self, that's perfect. But as we walk through the real world, we're not perfect. We'll never be perfect. And if we accept this darkness that we have in us and say it's always going to be there, I think that makes forgiveness this easier thing.
Completely. I love this approach. Exactly. Acceptance is the most important word, even to
Yeah.
change. Like we need self-awareness, but also we need to accept whatever it is that we have to accept: our vulnerability, our pain, our pains, our flaws. And then when we accept, we are able to make a change.
Oh, I love that. Yeah, because I thought about this as I've been on my, I had my kind of awakening experience. And as I've been on this spiritual journey, I still have these attachments to life. I'm not going to float off into the ether and be a transcended being.
Yes, yes.
So I
But
have
there's
to
always,
accept these things.
yeah, there's always this thing where, you say the word spirituality, and I imagine a monk
Yeah,
like
right.
meditating all day, and that's not real. Like that's impossible. And even more in our current lives, which are completely quick and hyper connected. So, how do you find these moments where you are able to connect, and how do you manage?
We have more time than we think. Time is this very human construct. Time doesn't exist. We are every day and every moment. But we
Yeah.
invent time so that we can schedule things, and even so that you and I can talk on this podcast. But it's a human
Yeah.
construct. It's so we have to realize that we have time. We can slow things down. I think meditation's great. I think we should meditate whatever works for us. Doesn't have to be traditional. Like I light candles and get in the bath and have a bath pillow and meditate. Uh, and that's meditative and relaxing. And I'm in touch with myself and the universe while it's happening. And I'm warm. So warm is good.
Yeah, I like that. I
Um,
like that.
so I think it's that kind of thing. What gets you in touch with yourself? What relaxes you? What allows you to it goes back to letting go in like micro ways. Like we don't have to let go. It doesn't always have to be, oh, I'm letting go of this trauma from my past, or I'm letting go of this relationship, or I'm letting go of this thing. Sometimes it's just letting go of all the BS in our life, all the noise, and just letting it go.
Yeah, and letting go is a very important concept, and it's even like the fact of living lighter, taking the things less seriously. That's also letting go.
Yeah. Oh, my favorite quote is, even as a child, before I was spiritual, life is too important to be taken seriously, by Oscar Wilde. That's the way,
Yeah,
you know,
yeah,
have fun, have
completely.
joy. And if you're not, then we're doing it wrong. Cause,
Yeah.
and I go back to my time overseas, even back when I was at Task Force Black in Afghanistan, like I was a very positive person. I was a very kind person. And I made sure that I was at our unit for a long time, so I was kind of like the cruise director. So I made sure our guys had high morale and they had fun, because we were at war and it sucked, but we still had fun. We still made time to have joy in our lives, and I think that really made us a better unit. So I think that's going to apply even in the middle of the darkest places.
And when you came out of that life and you wanted to change and you were feeling empty, trying to find this new purpose, um, you there were moments where you wanted to go back to war, as it was like an addiction that you needed
Oh
it.
yeah,
And how was that?
I was addicted to war. I was completely addicted to war. There's actually a comedy drama movie with Tina Fey in it called Whiskey Tango Foxtrot, and she's a journalist, but she gets addicted to it. The helicopters and the explosions and all of it, and it's incredibly uh, it's adrenaline. I mean, my brain was physically rewired to be around all this stuff all the time. I mean, it's exciting. It's exciting stuff. And then you
And also
you get
like the
away.
dopamine, the
Yeah,
dopamine
you
in the
you get it from
brain.
an athlete perspective, because you ran. I mean, you were training and you're getting that drug mainlining into your amygdala and parts of your brain, and like you're
Yeah.
and then you stop doing that, then the world's just gray. You're just like looking around and everything is just bland. So
Exactly. I know that feeling so good. And it's like, yeah, so much we become these like dopamine seeking creatures because it's
yeah,
just dopamine, 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 dopamine. So when that's not in the picture, you're like, life is nothing, basically.
right. And then they're just eating a lot of cheese. So you know, or whatever, it's then you find
Yeah.
it wherever you can, so it's
Yes,
yeah,
exactly.
you just get lost. So yeah, I was a war junkie, and I'm okay talking about it now because I mean, Sebastian Younger, he did a really great TED talk, like a main TED talk on it, and talked about he was a journalist that wrote a book. He went to a forward operating base for 18 months and just lived it. And he talked about in his TED talk about being addicted to war.
Wow. It's incredible. Yeah, each person like could find an addiction in whatever stimulates us in a
Yeah.
way. But also is I find it important to be able to find satisfaction or a certain kind of feeling of excitement when there's something that's not so extreme.
Yeah, I love that. Because when you find something that generates that excitement in your brain that is this calm, peaceful thing, that's transcendent. That is where you're really bridging between the concrete reality and that spiritual side of things, I think, because I mean, you know, when we're balanced, our body when our mind, body, and soul are balanced physiologically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, it's peace. So it's such a peaceful, amazing feeling.
Yeah. And what do you think about when we say balance? Of course, it takes me to this thought of balance is health and maybe tranquility, being more calm, being able to be connected to my emotions, to my environment. But at the same time, the people that have achieved success or ultimate, like extreme pursuits and achieved their goals, I don't know if they lived a balanced life. So, what can you say about this?
Well, that's a really insightful question. I really love that. It makes me smile. I love that because I have a deep appreciation for zealots. For people that are wholly dedicated to their craft. To whether it could be Michael Jordan as a basketball player, it could be uh, an artist as a painter or a writer, and when you're completely dedicated to something, it is a spiritual thing. So I think that balance is great. It's important to know balance, but I think pursuing something that is your purpose, and that's why I think if we ask ourselves, and I mean the Hindus talk about this, and going back to the Vedas and the Bhagavad Gita, right? Finding your purpose, your sense of dharma. What's your higher purpose in life? If you live that, yeah, go all in. Go for it. Then you don't have to worry
Yeah,
about balance because you pursuing that higher purpose with a drive, that's part of the universal balance. So yeah, no, I think that's this beautiful concept. So I'm glad you brought it up. That's
yeah,
great.
I love this concept. And so, how do you work with your clients in this spiritual awakening or finding the purpose? Like, what's your methodology?
I I have a method I've developed. I call it the soul method. It's spirituality. What are your values? What are your beliefs? What does your spiritual self look like from a philosophical perspective? And then what do you believe in oneness of the universe, and how does that interact? What are you looking at with that? If you don't, that's okay too. Understanding yourself, understanding others, understanding your place in all of that. And then love, self-love, love of others. And then I call it life blocks, these blocks of life, like sleep or nutrition or fitness or,
Yeah,
all these things these lifestyle things. And so it's this holistic method, which I think is a word that gets used a lot, but I think it's an effective word of you take all those components and you figure out where is that line between them and how are you living in alignment with your mind, body, and soul. And that's how we come to this more joyful existence. So yeah, there's definitely a
I
methodology to
love
it, but it's tailored to each person because we're all different, what walking our own unique
exactly.
path.
Yeah. Everyone is bio-individual. Exactly. And so, yeah, I love your approach that by saying that these blocks are like these blocks in life which we need to maintain because they're like the building blocks of our lives. I really like
Yeah,
that word. And John, can you tell my listeners how to reach you if they wanna look what you're doing?
sure. Our main website is kishar.org. That's KISHAR.org. And that's the entrance to our spiritual community. People have great conversations, and it's a safe and welcoming place. That's where we can be contacted for individual spiritual coaching or guidance stuff. And it also has links to our socials, and we have a pretty good YouTube channel that talks about some of this stuff and as well.
What can you tell to someone that is in search of this purpose and maybe hasn't found it yet in their lives? What is your motivation, quote, or phrase that you would tell this person?
It's already there inside of you. And so you just have to do a little work to find the essence of what it is and follow that, and you'll find it. It's there. And if you need help, think about, if you've ever done something and gone to bed and you couldn't wait to wake up and do it again the next day, well, do that.
Good advice. I love that. Thank you so much, John, for this
Yeah.
conversation.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me on, Roberta. This was a great talk. I really enjoyed it.
My pleasure. Me too.